God's word is for us to be reminded of those things about God, like we just saw, about that we can trust him in times of trouble. And really the measure of our faith is best revealed when the heat is on, when things are not going so well, either in our personal life or the world in which we live. The world generally doesn't really care how life's going, if it's going well for us, but they want to know what's in us, all that stuff we sing about God and about the power of God. Is it real, not just in good times, but is it real when times are tough? And I wanted to talk about that, about the nature of God over these next little while, so that we, I guess, again are convinced of the God we serve and how we come to our understanding in that. And we hope that you'll be part of that as well. I had a bit of a week. I've got a bit of funny glasses at the moment because I have these things called transition glasses. Anybody else got transition glasses? Oh, well done. Look at us, all old people. And some people, it's kind of I mainly got it because I used to have clear glasses and sunglasses, and I'd lose both. I'd lose my seeing glasses, and I couldn't find my sunglasses, and so I just ended up saying, well, can you give me something that'll sort of cover both? And so they did. But the problem is that when you're indoors with transition glasses, this is all middle-aged stuff, by the way, people think you've got something wrong with your eyes, like you're sight impaired. I don't know what the term is at the moment. And this happened to me the other day. This is not an unfamiliar place to me. This is called Woolworths. There's no kickbacks here. This is just the shop I went to. And I was at Woolies and I was paying for whatever wonderful thing I was going to make that night for dinner. And I was going through the checkout and I was having some trouble with the checkout. And I thought, this isn't working. And there's a guy behind me, a younger guy, probably in his 40s or so. What's the matter with that? They're young people now in their 40s. And he was behind me, and and I was having trouble, and he tapped me on the shoulder and said, Sir, can I help you? And I don't need any help. So I said, no, mate, I'm good. So I continued to wrestle with this thing at the Woolies thing, and I looked over my shoulder, and the guy was talking to one of the people that habitate that area from the staff, and they're having a quiet word, and they're kind of pointing at me. And so these two are here. I'm here still struggling to pay for whatever filet mignon I'm having that night, and I look back and who I later learned was Trudy. Trudy came. Now, she wasn't just a young person. She was like an infant. She was in her 20s. And Trudy came over and she said, Sir, can I help you? I said, no, what's the problem? She said, well, we really try to help people with vision impairment because my glasses hadn't yet transitioned to clear. They thought I couldn't see. Oh, it was very nice of them. I had a bad attitude about them. But each of us saw that situation differently. I saw it as a kind of a knock upon my manhood or whatever. The guy saw it as an opportunity to help some old dude with transition glasses. And Trudy just wanted us to get out of the shop, I'd imagine. Perception is a really powerful thing. And our view of life and love and whatever happens in that, and relationships and hardships all contribute to the people we grow up to be. And same thing happens with our perception with God. There's a lot of exterior factors that affect our perception of who God is and how God is. And many reasons why some of us see God differently than others see God. And that's just the reality of life. And one of the challenges of fellowship is to understand that we all don't come from the same experience of life or faith. Some of us were raised up in church and we kind of have never had a time in our life, like me, where Jesus and God and all this stuff was part of their life. Others, well, this is all brand new and everything in between. So our perception of who God is, I wonder what it is that your perception of God is and how that was formed. I wonder if you ever sat quietly and thought about that, about, the God that I believe in or don't believe in, how did I get the perception about that either accepting of him or rejection? When I get people to describe God that they don't believe in, they usually describe someone who is very distant and angry. And I'm able to say to them, well, listen, I agree with you. I don't believe in that God either, because I don't believe God is like that. A very influential writer of the last century, a guy called A.W. Tozer, said that what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. Now, why would he say that? Perhaps it's because our perception of God and how we see God affects all the other things in our lives, either negatively or positively. What is our perception of God? What's your perception? What's mine? Is it changing? Does it change? I saw what's called the Pulpit survey. It was about 40,000 UK Christians. And they did this survey, a bunch of questions, but that's that very question. What is your perception of God? And this was sort of the breakdown of about 40,000 people. That's a big sample, isn't it? Authoritarian, over nearly a third. Distant and uninvolved, nearly a quarter. Benevolent, in other words, generous and kind. Critical, 16%, and other, I don't know what other is, but 5%. Overwhelmingly, depending on our experience, we have these different perceptions of God. If we think of God only as some sort of cosmic police officer, we'll always spend our lives avoiding him and avoiding getting busted. If we only think of God as this angry judge, then we'll never experience his forgiveness or his tenderness or his love or the attributes that we've already sung about, that love that's undeniable. So misconceptions about God can create this huge barrier in our own experience of God, but also informs us about our experience with other people. And a flawed perception of God can keep us from the love that we're designed to share with him and with others. We can even risk recreating a God that suits us better than he is. In fact, somebody said that years and years ago. I can't remember who the origin of this quote, but it said that God made man or humanity in his own image, and man has returned the favour. It's so easy to recreate a God in our own image rather than allow God to be God. We can end up with a perception of God that's no more than a better version of ourselves. For years I carried this perception of God myself, that God was just really, his function in my life was to wait until I'd messed up and then he would punish me, which I did and still do. I knew the Bible said that God loved me because I was growing up in church. I never had a weekend where I didn't hear that on multiple occasions over multiple services. Church for my family started at 9 o'clock and we went right through till 7 p.m. at night with a few breaks in between. We did the morning service, and once the morning service was over, we went to adult or children's Bible college, Bible school, Sunday school, that kind of thing, after church. And then we'd have lunch, and then we'd come back for an afternoon sort of singing session at about 3 o'clock. Then we'd go home, and we would do whatever you did on those Sundays. You weren't allowed to watch TV or do anything like that. And then at 6 p.m. we'd go back, and we would then have our evening service. And that'd wrap up about 7, and that was our day of rest. And so that was Sunday. So if you're watching our clock, mate, it was a long day of God, 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 God. My great frustration is when I turned to be a teenager and I knew that Countdown was on at 6 p.m. on a Sunday night. I used to be very good at feigning sore throats about 5 o'clock, but we still had to go and do the business, so to speak. But for years I carried this perception of God that I knew he loved me, but I thought God kind of had to love me. It was kind of his job to love me. So it was a very transactional kind of deal. And I knew that Jesus had died for me. But several years ago, a couple of decades ago, I asked God, in one of my asks of God, that I might see him differently, more accurately. And the thing I learned, and I'm still learning, that God not only loves me, but he wants to love me. He doesn't have to, he wants to. And that makes an enormous difference in any relationship, isn't it? If you know your parents don't just have to love you, but they want to love you, there's an intimacy that forms, not just in parent and child, but in spousal relationships, in friendships, in all relationships. So what I'm getting to is the perception of God changes the temperature of all our relationships in the world. But there's also a dark side to this perception of God. A few years ago I talked to a bloke, a man who he came to me. He's not involved in this church, so don't try to guess who this is. He came to me, he was having some trouble in his marriage, and he said to me, listen, I've kind of done the wrong thing, mate. And I said, well, don't call me mate. What have you done? What's the wrong thing? And he said, well, at work, I began a few months ago to start flirting with this woman. This guy's married with a couple of kids. I began flirting with this woman, and we were sort of banter, and it got a bit bawdy, and it wasn't, it was just me being flirty with her, and initially it was kind of this harmless fun, a bit of a joke, bit of an office thing, no harm, no foul, that kind of thing. I remember him saying that. But I've sensed lately that God is warning me to back off this. I said, do you think? Yeah. I think God is telling me that I really shouldn't do that because it's not really honouring to my wife and my kids and the family I've got. And it could go the wrong way, couldn't it? I said, yeah, it might. Anyway, a couple of months later, I met with him again. I said, how's all that going? He said, well, not well. I said, why? He said, well, the flirting, we went out on a drinks night and things got a bit out of hand and something happened there, and our flirting went the next step, and now my wife is separated from me, and I see my kids every 10 days or so. And anyway, long story short, it ended up destroying his marriage and his family. But I challenged him at that point to completely break it off, but he wouldn't. And he did what a lot of people do. They just went, I know this is wrong, but I'm going to do it anyway. Months later, from that last one, he came to me full of remorse and full of regret. But he'd make this statement that we often make. He said, why is this happening to me? Why would God allow this to happen to me and my family? Well, see, his perception of God was that God was kind of there when he needed him, and we'll talk about that a bit later, but to actually step back when he felt God was telling him to step back was a bridge too far. And so he had to own his decision, and all kinds of chaos and destruction took place. Our perception of God is a very powerful thing for good and for bad. Richard Foster, who wrote a number of influential books, he says to think rightly about God is as important sense to have everything right. And to think wrongly about God is in a sense to have everything wrong. Nothing twists or deforms the soul more than a low or unworthy conception of God. So I wonder what our perception of God is. I don't mean to judge anyone, but how was that perception formed? I know some of my building blocks on my perception of God. Perhaps you do too. Maybe you grew up in a house where God wasn't even a thing. There was an absence of God. People didn't believe in God. It was all nonsense and all that stuff. Well, that'll affect your perception of God. A bit later on, we're going to look at a couple of things that might help us with our vision of God and how it is that we access that.
your heartbeat. This love is so deep, it's more than I can stand. I melt in your peace, it's overwhelming. The more I seek you, the more I find you. The more I find you, the more I love you. I wanna sit at your feet, drink from the cup in your hand, lay back against you and breathe, feel your heart beating. This love is so deep, it's more than I can stand. I melt in your peace, it's overwhelming. I wanna sit at your feet, drink from the cup in your hand, lay back against you and breathe, feel your heart beat. This love is so deep, it's more than I can stand. I melt in your peace.
So I was getting a coffee down, my mate John down there. I put it on Rob James's tab most mornings. But, he said, "Do you want to hear a joke?" And I said, "No." But he told me anyway. He's one of those guys. He said to me, "What has eyes but can't see?" What do you think? Potato. He said, "It's a potato." And he laughed uproariously like he just invented humour or something. And he gave me my coffee, and I said, "Thanks, John. I'll see you probably tomorrow for another joke." And he said, "So you're going to the show now?" This is the show, by the way. He said, "You going to the show?" I said, "Yeah, going to the show." He said, "What are you talking about today?" I said, "John, I'm talking about potatoes." Not that you're potatoes. I'm talking about sight, about perception. You should come up. He said, No, I'm not going to come up. I said, "Okay, I'll see you tomorrow. But find a better joke for tomorrow." Perception is a really important thing. In my week of eye issues, I went to the optometrist. Anybody ever been to the optometrist and leave without glasses? Anyway, I went to this optometrist and they put this contraption on. That's not me, by the way. They put this contraption on you, don't they? And they go, "Well, how does that look? Click. How does that look? Good, right? How's your eyesight? Is it better? Is it worse? Do you need to spend this amount of money on getting new glasses?" And on it goes. And it got me thinking about the kind of lenses that we see perception through, or the lenses we see God through. Are really important. Philip Yancey, a really favourite author of mine, who wrote that great book, What's So Amazing About Grace. If you haven't read that book, you should read that book. It's a great book. And he said this: all of us in the church, that'd be us, need grace-healed eyes to see the potential in others and the same grace that God has so lavishly bestowed upon us. Fundamentally, Yancey's argument is that once a person becomes redeemed, becomes a Christ follower, it doesn't just affect whether or not they will steal at the local shops. It affects the way that they look at the world. And part of that world is to look at other people, that they begin to see other people as God would see them, as something and someone who is made in the image and likeness of God. Now, I granted this, that sometimes you have to look really hard for that. Certainly at times in my life you have to look really hard to see that in me. Grace-healed eyes. And what happens is that we receive these sort of spiritual lenses, if you like, that clarify our perception of God and our spiritual vision. So I want to just run through 2 or 3 of those for you today. The first one is this. When we truly have spiritual eyes or grace-healed eyes, we discover that God is not like us. God is not like us. God is not simply a projection of the best we can be. God is something other than us. Now, let me throw a couple of verses at you if you can see these. For my thoughts, says Isaiah 55, are not your thoughts. This is God speaking. Either are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. God is not like us. But then you think, well, doesn't it say somewhere in the Bible, probably at the beginning somewhere, that we were made in the image and likeness of God? Well, it does. Right back in Genesis chapter 1 and verses 27 says exactly that. Well, isn't that one of those contradictions? Well, it's not a contradiction because that's not what Genesis is saying. It's not saying that we were created to be God. We were to be like God, and at our absolute best, when love is evident in us, there is an image, an echo, a hint of who God is like. We are never more like God than when we love. But God is more unlike us than like us. We are made in his image, not the other way round. So God is not the projection of all our values, but he is God, and he projects his values on us. I heard this week 2 prayers from 2 prominent Christians in America, both praying the same prayer for 2 separate parties to win the upcoming election. Both prominent, both sincere, both believed in the same God. One prayed that the Republican Party would be successful. The other one prayed that the Democratic Party would be successful. I watched them at about an hour apart, and I thought to myself, what do you do with those kinds of prayers? And contained in those prayers was a projection of a political view. God is not Labor or Liberal, Democrat or Republican, Raiders or Panthers, certainly not Magpies. God is something other. He is not who we have redefined him to be. Here's another verse. It says, do you not know and have you not heard, the Lord is an everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He's not just talking about Theodore there. The ends of the earth. He's talking about the whole earth, right? The whole earth. He will not grow tired or weary, and his understanding no one can fathom. We are not like God, or God is not like us. We are made in the image and likeness of God, and when we show love as redeemed people, we are never more God-like, if you like, but we are not in ourselves God. Now that might be news to some people sitting around you. You are not God. There's a famous story, I might have told it before, but Philip II, not the Queen's consort, Philip, the father of Alexander the Great, was the great king of Macedonia. And he had an interesting duty for 2 men from his army. He was always accompanied by 2 men who had a very specific and interesting duty. Here's the duty. One man was to say to Philip II, each morning he woke up, he was to say to Philip, remember you are but a man. And then they'd probably get to breakfast. But remember you are not a man. And the second man, when the king retired every night to go to sleep, he would say, this was his duty, Philip, you have remembered that you are but a man. Imagine having that happen to you every day. I might ask Mike and Rob to... No, I won't do that to me. This might be news in this narcissistic world, but the position of Almighty God is already taken. God is not like us, but we are echoes or like him when we love. Here's the second lens. Left to ourselves, we can reduce God to manageable terms. We manage God. The idea of this all-knowing, all-powerful God is often so overwhelming. We often respond, at least I do, to shrinking God into a much more manageable size. Like a Tamagotchi. Who remembers Tamagotchi? Where God can be manipulated in any way that I feel comfortable with. Again, A.W. Tozer wrote these great things very articulately. He said, left to ourselves, we tend to immediately reduce God to manageable terms. We want to get him where we can use him, or at least know where he is when we need him. We want a God we can in some measure control. And the temptation is to make God subservient to our will rather than us be subservient to his. The Apostle Paul talked about that to the Church of Rome, didn't he? He said, there was a time when, although they knew God, they didn't honour him as God. They thought something different or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking and their foolish hearts were darkened. And then they claimed to be wise. They became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. This is sort of a totemism of God, that God is a token in our life rather than the God whose will we serve. The clay can often be tempted to want to be the potter and to recreate a God in our own image. So we end up worshipping ourselves, you see. Here's the third lens. The third lens is this, that God can be known as God reveals himself to us. God is so unlike us. He is so above us. How are we supposed to know him? Well, God has taken the initiative to be known. It would be a terrible thing in life, I've said this a number of times over the years, to go through your whole life and not be known by anybody. That you get so good at a chameleon type face mask wearing thing that you just sort of never are known to anybody. You never risk being who you are with anybody. And you die and people didn't know, well, he seemed like a nice bloke, but I didn't know him. Nobody knew him. That's a sad thing. Well, God has chosen in a few different ways to be made known. There was a guy back in the 2nd century, a guy called Irenaeus of Lyons. He didn't live in Lyons, but Irenaeus of Lyons, it was Lyons. He said in this is, without God, God cannot be known. There's the full quote. No man can know God unless God has taught him. That is to say that without God, God cannot be known. Well, how has God made himself known? He has taken the initiative, and we know that there are a few different ways that God has been made known. We know that he has been made known through nature. For since the creation of of the world, God's invisible qualities, those things you can't touch, see, smell or taste, his eternal power, his divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. Beautiful sunrise, beautiful sunset. Instead of saying, wow, it leads us to a point of worship. Looking through a telescope into the skies and seeing the vastness of the expansion of the skies, we go, wow. See, our perception affects our reality. Nature preaches a million sermons to the human heart. Everyone who has ever watched any of that finds something of the character of God. But here's the thing about nature. Nature can only give you a partial picture of who God is. There's a second way, and that is through his word. That's why we make a big deal about the Bible. As complicated and as mysterious as the Bible can be. In Proverbs 2, verses 1 to 5, there's a really interesting verse. It says, "My child, listen to me and treasure my instructions. Tune your ears to wisdom and concentrate on understanding. Cry out for insight and understanding. Search for them as you would for lost money or hidden treasure. Then you will understand what it is to fear the Lord and to gain knowledge of God. So through nature, through his word, and obviously through the gift of his Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. A long time ago, in many times, in many different ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, those kind of odd people in the Old Testament. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he also created the world. If you want to know what God is with skin, it's Jesus, the incarnation of God. Colossians tells us that he is the image of the invisible God. So we think of God in sort of an abstract way. We can think of Jesus. In fact, it says in that same book of Hebrews, it says that the Son, that is Jesus, is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. And after he has provided the purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. Through nature, through his word, and through his Son, Jesus is the piece that makes all the other pieces, for me at least, make sense, or some sense. There's a great author, a woman called Sally Lloyd-Jones, and she put it like this. She said, there are lots of stories in the Bible, and we all love stories, but all the stories are telling one big story. The story of how God loves his children and comes to rescue them. It takes the whole Bible to tell this story, and at the centre of the story there is a baby. We're about to come into that Advent season. Every story in the Bible whispers his name. He is like the missing piece of the puzzle, the piece that makes all the other pieces fit together. And suddenly, you can see a beautiful picture. This is the God in whom we trust. Not the trust in a God that we've created or reinvented or reimagined, but the God who reveals himself, who says to us, you will seek me and find me and be able to see me if you seek me with all of your heart. So let's discover the God in whom we trust. We're going to pray together, and then I'm going to ask you...